So welcome everyone for coming. This is always exciting when we have an external speaker coming in and talking about something exciting. I'm Terry Huja. I'm the manager of the Program Development Office here at CADTH. I'm also involved with some of our RWE efforts here within CADTH, so kind of why we brought in our guest speaker today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Algonquin Nation, whose traditional and unceded territory we are gathered on today. So we would like to welcome today Dr. Mina, Tadrous, who is a very distinguished researcher who's coming to us. He is currently a research associate with the Ontario Drug Policy Research Network, or ODPRN, and is an assistant professor at the Leslie Dan School of Pharmacy at the University of Toronto, and a fellow at the Institute of Clinical Evaluative Sciences. He has a PhD in pharmacoepidemiology and a master's in health outcomes and policy research, and a doctor of pharmacy. So he's got lots of stuff under his belt. It's great. Today, he'll be talking about something which has been really relevant and topical, and that is the topic of real-world evidence. I know it's important because my mom said it to me today. She said, "Daddy, keep it real." So I know that this is really important. So the topic today is real-world evidence and the increasingly important role it plays in developing evidence-based drug policy and reimbursement decisions. So we can see why it's relevant to us here at CADTH. So we'll give Dr. Mina 30 to 40 minutes to talk, and we'll give us about 15 minutes for questions at the end. So for those of you here in the room, we'll put your hand up and we can answer your questions. And for those of you who are online, you can send your questions to events@cadth.ca, and we'll do our best to try and get them all together and have Mina answer them for us. And with that, I give you the floor.
Awesome. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me, and really excited for this opportunity to kind of discuss a very interesting topic. I'm a little surprised that more than 5 people want to jump this, but I guess it kind of speaks volumes about, picking the title. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So before I jump into this, just some quick disclosures that I do work for the Ontario Drug Policy Research Network, or ODPRN. ODPRN is funded by the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, the SPORE network through CHR, and we do have support from the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences. I have no other personal or financial relationships to disclose. So a lot of this is all my opinion. So if you don't like something I say, you can yell at me. Please don't talk to my bosses and keep me out of trouble. So I do have some promises for you before we go in. So it's like a contract between us. The first is that hopefully you'll better understand how real-world evidence can inform drug policy. The second is you'll probably get sick of some cartoons. I do enjoy the occasional meme or cartoon, so please just let me enjoy this. And my third promise is really just try to keep this interesting and try to give you a flavor of how real-world evidence has been able to influence and inform drug policy in Ontario. So what we'll cover today is we'll look at what real-world evidence is, which is a bit of a loaded statement, but we'll try to break it down from my perspective. We'll talk about the context of the real-world evidence in Ontario and what perspective and lens we're giving it at the ODPRN. And then we'll talk about types of real-world studies, and we'll break that down into 3 types of studies that I think have been very influential in drug policy. I'll give some final thoughts, and then I'll open it up to questions at that point. So who are we at the ODPRN? Just for anyone who's not familiar with the work we do. So it's a group of researchers led by 3 distinguished researchers, so Tara Gomes, Mohammed Zandani, and David Yerlink are the PIs for the group. And it was founded in 2008 with the primary objective of working with the Ontario Public Drug Program, so OPDP, in a manner to help answer their questions and inform their research in a timely, relevant manner that addresses the questions that they have the need for. And that's really the main focus of all the work that we do. But we have sort of expanded into other fields, and we'll kind of talk about some of that work that's been being done. So real-world evidence, and probably why a lot of people are kind of logged in right now, is because of the topic. And, at first, I think there's a lot of individuals in my field, observational researchers, who are probably rolling their eyes when they saw this title. Because when you ask people about real-world evidence, they'll say simply, we've been doing this for years, right? But the reality is, and I'm very thankful, that it's made it a lot easier to explain to people what we did. So before, as I'm trying to make some friends at a party, I'd have to say, what do you do? And I'd say, I do observational research that influences and informs drug policy using administrative claims data. But now, I get to say, I do real-world research using big data. And everyone all of a sudden wants to talk to me. Before, they would just leave me alone, kind of talking in the corner by myself. And so, without a doubt, the idea of real-world evidence is a hot topic, and I think there's a reason for that. And one of the major reasons is that the methodology over the last 10 to 15 years has advanced significantly, and the data is finally in a place where there is some real potential to do some really great work. And so that growth and that opportunity has allowed us to grow, and that is why I think real-world evidence is sort of a hot topic, and a lot of people are starting to think about it. So what in the world is it? So real-world evidence is the use of data collected from a variety of sources that's used to help understand treatment approaches and to improve patient health. More importantly, it involves getting deeper insights and deeper understanding of the contextualization of what's going on in our healthcare system. But I think something that's really important to know, and it was noted in some of the reports coming out, that real-world evidence isn't just big data. So just having data is not enough to do this kind of work. But actually the strength of it, and this is a theme that's going to keep coming up, and again, is being able to link and bring together multiple sources of data the same way that we do that with evidence. I think that that's what really makes this area really exciting and a lot more powerful. So real-world evidence has been around for a while, and it's been informing policy, I would probably say upwards of 20 years. But the first place that it really had the greatest effect in was in post-marketing safety. And I think that that's where everyone was okay with it. We all learned about the flow of how drugs are approved. We would talk about phase 4 trials, which really were post-marketing research studies, which were often open-label studies, and they started using large administrative databases and, launching things in the U.S. like the Sentinel program. And they were really a lot of investment in understanding that using real-world evidence for safety could help replace the weaknesses that was coming from the clinical trials. And so that's why there was a lot of growth there. But recently, there's been a growing interest to integrate real-world evidence into reimbursement. And I think this is where we are today, trying to figure out how best to do this and where we can use that different information. So most evidence is used in the drug approval and reimbursement has been limited to clinical trial evidence. But we know that we're getting submissions with more and more evidence. We're getting requests for things, and there's certain limitations to what we're able to assess. It was really easy to rely on clinical trials when we had statin trials with massive amounts of groups. But now that we're getting indications of only 100 people across Canada, what are we able to actually do in those situations? We know that clinical trials are the gold standard for getting a product onto the market. And I don't think that real-world evidence is going to ever replace that. But I do believe that there are some issues with generalizability that are the classic reasons why people are looking to real-world evidence. We have healthy user bias in the clinical trials. This is often why drugs are disappointing when they hit the market. They don't work as well as they did in the clinical trials for a variety of different reasons. Polypharmacy is a major issue that we're trying to deal with, and understanding that when we introduce a drug onto the market, it's not going to be in new users. The understanding of various models of care is really important to understanding how this can be used across in various jurisdictions, various types of care, even the differences between community care and acute care creates differences. Another huge issue is off-label use. Once a drug has entered the market, is it being used as it's intended? And are there other indications that have started to be used that we can't understand? And so there's limited evidence. And then lastly, and I kind of hinted towards this, was the idea of smaller sample sizes. This is, again, the reason why real-world evidence boomed and observational research tried to fill that void with drug safety. But now it's becoming more and more important as we look at rare diseases and rare indications, as we try to fill that gap, because the clinical trials may not allow us to actually assess how they're working. To conduct real-world evidence, there's a variety of different evidence points that we can get in. So data can include things like EMR, health registry, administrative claims data, which is where I'm going to concentrate on today, and the bulk of the work that we do leverages. But it's important to remember what we talked about in the beginning, that the data is a really great opportunity to do this, but there are multiple sources that are coming in, and it really becomes powerful when you start to link it. And so what's starting to happen a lot is that the ability to link these is really opening up a lot of different opportunities. So administrative claims data, for those who are not familiar with this, is using administrative data as an opportunity to conduct the real-world evidence, but more importantly, it gives us a lot of opportunities to do things that we weren't able to do before. So we can actually look at the real-world patterns of drug use in the population. We could get massive sample sizes that we weren't getting before. So you can imagine how many, like the biggest trial you have could be 10, 15, 20,000 people, but we can easily, on a brand new drug, get 20,000 users just in the first year. It's quick and less expensive, which is sort of foreshadowing why this is a really great tool to work with policymakers. Often, policymakers want a decision made in the next few days. They don't want it in 2 years once your recruitment's over. And so this becomes a really great tool to be able to answer the questions they have. There are some limitations that are classically associated with the use of administrative claims data. So the validity of using something that was originally intended for billings, like these are just basically receipts of something that's been paid for versus research. But there's a bulk of work that's going on in the background that's helping to validate these tools, validate these codes, and has really strengthened the use of these, that I think this limitation that's classically associated with this is sort of diminishing over time. The second is the ability to assess some confounders and issues that we have, such as lifestyle, disease severity, OTCs. But again, as the data is getting better, we're starting to fill that. So a classic limitation was that we didn't have lab values, but now we're starting to pull in lab values, EMR, and those things are getting linked and making the data a little bit richer. There is continuing development and advancing the methodologies to address confounders, but this has come a really far way in the last 15 years. And I think some of these limitations are becoming less and less an issue, and more of the issue is actually how do we incorporate this into what we're already doing. So the bulk, as an example of the work that we do, uses data from the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Science. So phonetically, people are pronouncing this ITES. You may hear me slip and say ISIS. As a large Middle Eastern man, I think I'm probably the most uncomfortable person saying that ever. But, you know, just bear with me, but we're trying. I think they're working on changing the idea there. But basically, it's Institute that's founded on linking a whole bunch of data together that's coming in from Ontario. And so you can have things like hospital visits, physician visits, going to the pharmacy, and even bringing in things like coroner's data or StatsCan data to better understand that. And it's that linking of the data that really makes it powerful. The big data on its own, like if you just had drug claims data, that's great. You know, you could run drug utilization, and some of that stuff is pretty interesting. But it's really the linking that makes something really powerful and extremely, extremely interesting. And I think that's the real power of what's happening at the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences. And it's through that we're able to access this data readily, quickly, and importantly, with large sample sizes that are really useful in making decisions. So this administrative data, again, is secondary use of billing data or tracking claims, but we're able to link it across and watch, you know, a patient go through the system through the various different parts, everything from their hospitalizations, their emergency room visits, to their visits to the pharmacy. So this allows us to explore things like prescriptions, costs of medications, their demographics, doctor's visits, past diagnoses, and procedures. And so we're able to paint a story of what's happening. The way I explain this simply is if somebody emptied out their wallet of their receipts the day before, I can tell you what they actually did, right? You could find which restaurant they ate at, what they ordered, maybe they purchased something, and through that you can sort of paint a picture of what's going on, and that's what we actually try to do. With that being said, there are some limitations to this, right? Like if I tracked your receipts yesterday and I saw that you ordered, you know, the pasta, I don't know if you liked it, right? Like there are some richness that is missing in the data, and I think that's a very important thing to understand, and a limitation that we're still kind of working on when we do this. So how does this fit into policy? And where does this fit into the drug's life? And I think when I think about how real-world evidence can be integrated into a drug life, it's really a tale of two cities, in the sense that there's market entry, and then there's this idea of reevaluation modernization. And they're often non-overlapping, although in a perfect world, they should be completely overlapping. And so the integration of this has sort of been lacking in one area, and this is where we're going to be doing a lot of work. But at the same time, a lot of the examples I'm going to give today are in the secondary. So market entry is where we hope that we can future integrate more examples of real-world evidence. So as you can imagine, it's currently, of the two, the one that has the least applications of real-world evidence. It has potential uses in doing everything from budget impact analysis before a drug is reimbursed, inputs into economic evaluations by having real-world drug utilizations, demographics from the population of who could potentially use the medication, adherence, real-world effectiveness that could be inputted in. And then they can also supplement evidence submissions. And I think that this stuff can be really helpful in trying to make better decisions before a drug is added onto the formulary or reimbursed at all. It also is important in helping us figure out which type of listing that we'll go for and who we want to pay for that drug for it. And this is, you know, some of the examples I'm going to show you. But really, in my opinion, and we can talk about this a little bit during the question session, is that the golden grail, in my opinion, is how do we incorporate this real-world evidence into outcomes or performance-based reimbursement? And how do we actually incorporate this into the life of a drug throughout it, not just at a one point where we assess it using real-world evidence and then we forget about it? How do we continually incorporate it from the moment that it's entering the market and allow it to kind of develop in that way? The reality is it's not an issue of methodology. In my opinion, it's not an issue of often, not an issue of data. It's an issue of details and figuring out what structure is going to work, the framework that's going to allow this to happen. And this is really where I believe that a lot of the work can be done and should be done. Currently with Revaluation Modernization, a lot of the examples I'm going to be presenting today are going to come from this, so we'll kind of dive into this and allow this to happen. And what do I mean by this? So if you can imagine a formulary as a living, breathing entity, or in our case, a closet that's been neatly cleaned up. You know, when you first set it up, it's really great. You picked out which drugs you wanted to pay for, which things you wanted to include. You have the criteria beautifully laid out. But over time, it starts to look like my closet, which is the fact that you start throwing things in. You get a new drug on market entry, you don't assess it as a drug class, but you just throw it into the closet. And what happens is that you've actually not modernized it or taken into account things like which drugs have gone generic, what the actual utilization is like, which things are being used off-label, which drugs are being prescribed inappropriately. But you made that decision at market entry. You didn't make that decision once there's been 10 new drugs in the same drug class. And so this modernization process is essential to making sure that your formulary is neat and tidy. But making those kind of decisions has a lot of different inputs. It's not as easy as saying that you understand how one drug works or if there's efficacy of any sort. So taking things into account like effectiveness and safety, patient and clinician perspectives, stakeholder feedback, environmental scans of how other payers are doing it, cost effectiveness, and cost and utilization data analytics are really important to doing that. And where real-world evidence can really be helpful is in two of those nodes, the effectiveness and safety and cost and utilization data analytics. So how does Ontario use this? So they basically have three tools that they use in their formulary to help control and navigate people through the formulary. And so you'll hear me use these terms, so I'm kind of presenting them here so we can understand that. The first is a general benefit, which means anyone who's reimbursed or beneficiary of this can get access to that. The second is limited use, or LU, which means that they can get access more readily and easily, but they just need to have a criteria written on the prescription. And the last is exceptional access program, which is a prior authorization program where they have to meet and submit paperwork or over the phone be approved for getting a certain medication. So now we'll dive into some examples. And what I'm really hoping to do here is kind of walk you through what I cluster as three types of real-world evidence that we've conducted at the ODPRN. The first is utilization analytics, policy evaluation is the second, and then the third is real-world effectiveness and safety. Now, importantly, by design, you're going to notice that the complexity increases over time, but what I really want to illustrate here is that very simple studies can have massive impact, and really complicated studies can be done and also have impact. And I hope that I can show you the story as we walk through this. So utilization analytics. So the first example is a very simple one. The payers in Ontario noticed that there was an increased use of inhaled tobramycin. Simple drug utilization internally showed that they can see that climbing. And this is one of those examples where just having drug data wasn't enough. They didn't understand why it was going on. The current LGU criteria only reimbursed it for cystic fibrosis, and there was concern that off-label use was starting to expand into COPD patients. The issue there is that there's actually not that strong of evidence in using inhaled tobramycin for COPD patients. So the question was, what is the current utilization of inhaled tobramycin in Ontario, and which populations are actually using it? And so that information could be used to go reassess and discuss with the manufacturer the labeling to see if there could be further evidence submissions or see where there could potentially be a gap. And so what we did is a very simple study. It was a cross-sectional time series analysis from 2007 to 2015, and we looked at it quarterly. And this is, a lot of the studies I'm going to be presenting are all published, so if you don't believe me, you can look it up. And so, you know, this was, so the stratification that we were able to do by linking the data was actually looking at the diagnosis codes. So we looked at folks who had a diagnosis at initiation of cystic fibrosis because we had a verified and validated registry, and COPD because we also had a registry of patients and a validated cohort that we were able to link and look at them as well. So this is simply what we found, and I think this is a really simple one figure that can kind of show that. So the green line here over time is actually the total utilization of tobramycin. This is what they already knew. It's going up, right? And it's climbing over time from 2007 to 2015. The red line that you see there are patients with cystic fibrosis, and the blue line are those with COPD. So what you're really seeing is that it's climbing in both groups. And it's not that the off-label use is just beginning, it's been happening the whole time. And it's accounted for about 50% of patients the entire time that was happening. And so the off-label use wasn't just causing the increase, it was a large portion of the increase, and so the utilization was going up. Only 50% of patients actually had cystic fibrosis, which was the intended LU code. And so that information was useful for them to go and look at if there needed to be changes to the LU code, getting further submission, and speaking with the manufacturer about what was actually happening. This is a little bit concerning because there were issues about the lack of evidence in this field. And so this was sort of a red flag saying that perhaps they should evaluate tightening up the reimbursement on inhaled tobramycin. But they have to balance that with patients getting access that they needed. So again, this is a really simple drug utilization that was linked to just diagnoses codes, but we were able to look at the real world evidence about what was actually happening in the utilization. You can also imagine that if a new drug was coming on with a very similar indication, you might be able to understand that you should probably be concerned with off-label use as well. And so this is informative for new drugs that are coming into market entry, understanding how many patients with cystic fibrosis are needing inhaled tobramycin. And so there's a lot of utilization from a very simple study that was able to pull in that information. The next example is actually a little biased. This is probably my favorite one, and the reason I really like this is because it's a national study, and also the ability, it was a really neat opportunity to kind of do some sort of ecological experiments in this way. So there was increased use of testosterone products among elderly men. In Ontario, all current formulations that are approved are listed as an LU product. There was a real concern over safety, because there's a lot of studies coming out about increased risk with cardiovascular risk. More importantly, there was a big push for low T, sort of more of a lifestyle testosterone that didn't really have any strong evidence. This specific study was actually part of a larger drug class review that incorporated a network meta-analysis and looking at the knowledge synthesis, but also new evidence supporting its qualitative studies to look at how it was being used by patients. But the question we wanted to specifically answer was, what's the current utilization of testosterone in Ontario, and how does that compare to other provinces? Now, highlighting here that Ontario has the most liberal listing in the entire country for these products, versus other provinces have varying different listings. And what was really neat here, and it doesn't always happen with every drug class, is every province attacked this drug class in a different way. So we can actually explore what that did to their utilization. And so what does current testosterone use meet the listing criteria? So this was a study that was done before this that showed the top red line there is the total testosterone utilization. And they conducted the study from 1997 to 2012. And you can see there that it's been slowly climbing over time. There was a small dive in 2006 when they changed the listing, but it's also the timing of the topical formulation that came on. And the topical formulation is the purple line in the bottom there, which you see slowly creeping up. Now, when we updated this study, the figure's not shown here, this continues to climb up. And that's the company that was pushing a lot of the low T, and this was the reemergence of using testosterone off-label in this sense. Now, the LGU criteria states that it's only limited to patients with confirmed low morning serum testosterone levels, meaning they have to have a lab value that proves that they have low testosterone for a variety of different indications. Now, in another study that we did, we actually went into the data and found that 10 to 17% of patients only had a diagnosis, which means a large portion of people had no evidence of why they were using testosterone. But more starkly, 1/3 of new testosterone replacement therapy users over age 65 had no testosterone level at all. So they were really just using this off-label, and so the combination of this is really important because it means that people are not using this drug correctly and not for the intended purpose. So what we did is we actually conducted a cross-sectional analysis on just 1 year, 2012, and then we looked at its use by formulation and by each province. Now, what was really neat here is that, again, you can notice that every province sort of looks like it has a different pattern, and the reason for that is every province is paying for these drugs differently. On the very far right, Ontario, you can see that the purple, the topical, is the most utilized drug of all, the second being the injectable. But if you add those all up, it also just has the highest utilization, period. Now, the two provinces I really want to draw your attention to are the first being Alberta, which has ready access to injectable drugs, does not list the topical, but they did allow access to the oral through a prior authorization. The second province was British Columbia, and British Columbia had really tight restrictions, and everything was only through prior authorization, and the only thing that you can get was injectables, and you can see that their utilization shows that. The only thing they paid for was injectables. But what was really neat here is that we can then take these results and imagine what would happen if we listed the drugs in Ontario the same way and how that would affect those utilizations. Now, to do this, we worked with some really smart economists. Yes, I just said you can work with economists, and we figured that out. And so what we were able to do is go to the policymakers and give them a menu of options. And who doesn't love a menu, right? And I think this was a really neat way of approaching it, where we can give option A, which was based on sort of the BC model, option B, looking at just sort of an Alberta-based model, and option C, looking at other provincial models, which would reduce it slightly. And so you can see there that based on the model you go for, in Ontario's current utilization, you can see dramatic drops of up to 42% of the budget, or downwards of 20%. And so this was submitted as part of a larger drug class review, but this was sort of supported by other facts of evidence, but we were able to use this utilization across provinces in a very neat and exciting way where it felt like sort of an experiment that was happening along the way. So that's great. So we make recommendations on things that are potentially going to happen. But what happens when a policy change is actually made? And this is sort of the second group that we think about when we think about studies that look at policy evaluation. And this is a cornerstone of a lot of the work that we do at ODPRN. So I'm going to cover two examples that I think are really great. It would not be an ODPRN presentation if I didn't talk about opioids. And so this is an example of the patch for patch program and how it was evaluated. So fentanyl patches are a synthetic opioid 100 times more potent than morphine. And before the recent spike in illicit fentanyl, one of the major sources of fentanyl on the streets was actually coming from diverted patches. And so these are available in a plethora of different strengths. But the really striking thing was how valuable a diverted patch was. In parts of Ontario, one of these patches could go for upwards of $500. And so you could see that there was a real issue with people diverting their patches. Even more strikingly, after you use the patch, the drug still remains in it, so it actually retains its value. And so there was a real issue with these finding their ways on the streets. And when we were doing research with using the coroner's data, we found a lot of deaths starting to happen near the time period of about 2013 to 2015, where there was a lot of folks who fentanyl was finding its way into a lot of these deaths. So the patch for patch program is very simply that for a patient to get a new refill of their patches, they would have to return the old ones. And if they don't return them, they don't get any more new patches. Now, the patch for patch program was actually first launched in Nipissing County, which had a really high utilization of opioids in 2013. It was a collaboration between law enforcement, pharmacies, physicians, and public health officials. And it expanded slowly to other provinces. Other counties. And what was really important here is that it was a voluntary program. It didn't really become law in Ontario until 2016, where it was mandatory across every single pharmacy. But this gave us a really great opportunity to be able to contrast counties that conducted it, counties that didn't do it so much, and what we were able to actually do. So for each outcome, you can imagine every county starting them separately. We were able to follow some counties for 24 months, and some we were only able to follow for 12 months. Our primary outcome was just looking at what did it actually do to fentanyl dispensing. The second thing, we looked at non-fentanyl long-acting, were people switching to other opioids. And then the real big question is, did it impact deaths or hospitalizations for opioid-related reasons? So the first figure here is actually just the rate of of fentanyl dispensing. So the top line in sort of the darker yellow there is a 24-month analysis. So this only includes counties that had 24 months of follow-up. Now, importantly, these counties are more likely to have higher rates of fentanyl dispensing, higher rates of hospitalization, and they were more likely to singularly, when we looked at each county by itself, have a dramatic drop on its own. Versus the 12-month analysis had some of these counties that were sort of late laggers, and they were also just not jumping on board as much. And we believe that that's actually because not all the pharmacies were participating. And so you see a real contrast there. With the 24-month, you see a 32% statistically significant drop in the rate of fentanyl dispensing. In the 12-month analysis, you sort of see a mixed signal there where it's not actually significant, and there's a question about if it works when not everyone is participating, which supports the idea of making it mandatory, because when some people don't and some people do, you may not get the full impact. When we looked at other long-acting opioids, so hoping that maybe perhaps people would be limited to their access to fentanyl and they would switch, we see no difference in either group. So there's no evidence to suggest that people stopped getting the fentanyl patches and switched to another opioid because it just became too tough. Now, the real money question is, did it help improve outcomes in any sort of manner? And I think this is a classic situation where we see this with a lot of things in the opioid question, which is that it made no difference. And so this here is actually hospital visits for an ED reason, looking at 6 and 12 months. And in both groups, we actually see absolutely no difference. And we also see the same thing with deaths. And so this is, both a good news and a bad news story. In the sense, it's a good news story because it didn't harm patients to limit their opioids, because you do worry that with the supply and demand that these patients don't stop using opioids, they just find other sources. And if that occurs, what happens is what's happening right now, which we start to see a spike in deaths. And so it was sort of a good news story in the sense that there wasn't that spike of any sort, but it was a bad news story because really this a patch-for-patch program by itself does not solve any of these problems. And I think this is something that a lot of people knew, but by evaluating this policy, you're able to tell other provinces that you can actually do this, but just make sure that you have other support systems and you have other programs and parts. This is not going to be a standalone solution, but it could be part of a larger opioid strategy. Another body of work that we've looked at that was a policy that was in place was the glucose test strips. And a lot of that work started because of CADTH, looking and realizing that glucose test strips were being overused, and you didn't really need to use them a lot in every single population. Ontario placed restrictions, and so there was a concern over the impact of the new policy on test strip utilization, but more importantly, health outcomes. Because after the limited test strips, there was a lot of people asking, well, did it actually adversely affect patients in being able to their A1C or hospitalization? So what we did is we looked at how the new test strip policy impacted utilization and spending, but then we also looked at if the new limits impacted health outcomes of these diabetic patients. So just as a reminder, the Ontario policy that came into place in 2013 limited them by the drugs they were on, right? So insulin users still got a 3,000 test strips. Hypoglycemia-inducing agents were limited to 400, and all others were down to 200. So over time, and this is in the Canadian Journal of Diabetes, what you can actually see is that at the spike happening there, which is the big spike in 2013, there was a lot of people who stocked up and stockpiled on their test strips, but then over time you see a drop of about $23.9 million in just 1 year from just changing this limited thing. But we already knew that it was going to save money because you were limiting it to the amount, but that's not actually the real important question. The real important question was, is it going to impact or adversely impact outcomes in any sort of manner? And so what we were able to do is link that utilization of people who were impacted by it and look at health outcomes. So what we did is we conducted a cross-sectional time series analysis from 2008 to 2015. We looked at outcomes quarterly, and then we hierarchically looked at each group, so those 4 groups that were limited in any manner. And then we conducted ARIMA models, and we stratified everything by less than 65 and over 65, understanding that there might be differences in these populations. So the first figure here actually shows the rates of both hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia hospitalizations and ED visits. Just ED visits. And what we find over time, so the blue line represents the solid blue line is those under 65, and the red line represents those, so the straight lines are hypoglycemia of the rate of under 65, and then the red solid line is hyperglycemia of those under 65, with both blue lines representing hypoglycemia and the red lines representing hyperglycemia. And what you actually see over time is that there's no significant difference in the rates of hospitalizations. We actually saw a strange thing where it looked like there was a downward trend, but that wasn't significant either. But importantly, there was no increased spike in hospitalizations that was occurring after, during, or at any time during this policy. We actually did sensitivity analysis looking at those in the higher groups that had higher utilization to begin with, and we found no signal at all whatsoever. What we were also able to do is link lab values from a subgroup of patients looking at A1C, because maybe it was impacting their clinical outcomes. And what we found there was sort of the same story, that the A1C on average of those having an A1C mean value was not changing over time. Now, I think importantly, and something that came up after we did some of these studies is, with real-world evidence, we look at some of these outcomes, but there's some things that we're not understanding and we can't get at with real-world evidence. The patient experience, if there's patient-reported outcomes that are important, and some of these require other types of studies, such as qualitative evidence, that would help us better understand some of that. And again, that goes into that whole model of having multiple inputs into making decisions. But I think what was really concerning for the policymakers and what they were hearing is that potentially some folks could experience adverse effects. But I think this kind of study, using real-world evidence, was able to draw from the large amounts of data, linking of lab values, and able to say that this policy did not actually adversely affect these patients, and there's no signal to believe that these patients are being harmed in any way. The last area of work I want to look at, and I'm going to go over one example, is real-world effectiveness and safety. And I think this is sort of the interesting example that could be sort of more inclined with the reimbursement-based outcomes and looking at market entry, and becomes really important. So the example I want to discuss today is Xolair, or omalizumab. It's a humanized monoclonal antibody, so that's targeting IgEs. And in general, it just reduces the mediator release and allergic response, and it's indicated for both severe asthma and urticaria in adults and adolescents with moderate or severe disease. So currently in Ontario, this drug was, at the time of the study, was listed as the Exceptional Access Program for anyone above the age of 12 with severe asthma. And they have to have a bunch of criteria to meet this for their prior authorization, including lab levels for their IgE, a major hospitalization or ED for asthma in the past 12 months, oral corticosteroid use, certain drug use that they had to show that they've tried other treatments. So basically, it was a last line for very severe patients. Now, the utilization you can see here, there's no statistical test here, but it's going up, and the use is going up over time. By the second quarter of 2015, there was 373 users, and they were spending about $2.3 million in just that quarter on this medication. So for very few users, they're spending quite a bit of money, and so the question naturally is it working? And so are they getting what they're actually paying for? And this is the question that we tried to explore in this study when we looked at the real-world healthcare utilization of this drug. So we looked at all patients who were new users between 2012 and 2013, but we wanted to match them. And I think when we did a rapid review of the literature, we found that a lot of the real-world studies were really lacking in the sense that they would look at pre-post analysis of patients who started Xolair, but they would never have a control group, which really limits it because over time we know that things can change. And we couldn't find a single study with that. And so it was very important. We spent a lot of time trying to find the correct controls. And so we matched them with patients with asthma through a validated database who did not use omalizumab at any point during the study. We did a 4-to-1 match. We found as many matches as we could find. And we matched on age, sex, specialist visit, because we knew that was associated with getting Xolair. We matched with OCS doses or oral corticosteroid doses. We matched them being on severe asthma using the GINA guidelines. And we also matched on Charlson Comorbidity Score, which is based on hospitalization. So we tried to match them as much as possible so that they were almost as similar. Massive limitation, we didn't have IgE levels. So that's the one area that we didn't know how good the match was, but we knew on a bunch of factors that it was there. Now, the primary outcome we actually looked at was total direct healthcare costs, which is a really nice composite of everything from hospitalizations, ED visits, physician visits, medications, and any other provincial service that they were getting through the healthcare system. And the idea here is that if they're both asthma patients and they're matched really tightly, the drug should reduce those because one of the major drivers will be hospitalizations, ED visits, physician visits. So we should see a decline if the drug's actually working really well. But we also looked at hospitalizations and the ED visits for asthma, use of SABA puffers to rescue inhalers. We looked at prescriptions for oral corticosteroid use and the number of physician visits as well to try to explore maybe there's other signals that we can try to figure out here. So we conducted an individual matched repeated measures analysis, and we used mixed effects models. We did it as a pre-post analysis. So we looked at people right before for 1 year and then right after for 1 year. And the outcomes were fitted for different distributions based on types of data. And if there was any imbalances that we couldn't get through matching, we also controlled for those confounders as well. And so those were the same ones that we were interested in before. So this was actually our primary outcome here. So the red line is the non-Xolair. So these are our controls. And you can see that they're controls because they're sort of staying flatlined over time. Remember that this is their median cost over the entire study of all individuals that were matched. The blue line is actually individuals on Xolair. So before that time period, they were about the same. And when we do the confidence interval, there's actually no statistical difference between them. But they look like they're pretty parallel right before. The black line running vertically through that is actually the time that they get Xolair. So you mimic that with the matches. And so what we see over time is that there's a massive spike upwards of about $1,700. That matches nicely with the exact cost of Xolair, right? So, but what then we see is that they flatline. So we get this increased cost of Xolair, and over time we don't see actually any differences between the two groups. And when we looked at various different models of looking at the trajectory of it, there's actually no statistical difference. When we take out drug costs as a secondary analysis and just look at all healthcare utilization, we find the same thing, because you can imagine that delta's gone, and then the lines stay the same. And we looked at it through multiple different ways to try to better understand it. Now, when we looked at hospitalizations on the left-hand side there and OCS prescriptions on the right-hand side, we also did not find any statistical differences between the groups at all. Now, one thing that's important to note is because this population is so small that we actually have to censor some of that data on the left-hand side. Also, interestingly, the Xolair group in the blue there on the right-hand side had higher OCS prescription levels to begin with. And so that was sort of interesting. We had to control for that to begin with. But what's really neat, well, not neat, is that the dose, it didn't change over time at all. So the trajectory is actually what we're looking at. We're not interested if there's a massive delta. You should see that their dose is slowly coming down, and there was no statistical difference in that sense. But as part of our work, we wanted to better understand not only just a broad sweeping statement about, well, does this drug not work or work, but who potentially could it work best in? So we actually went in and created a sub-cohort who directly matched the RCT population, those who are a subgroup of ICS plus LABA users, which matches directly the inclusion criteria for the clinical trials, which was supposed to be the EAP criteria, but was not in our entire population. And what we found actually, even though this is a subgroup, so we only had about 25 to 30 people, depending on how we did the analysis, that found this. But we did find a signal that the oral corticosteroid prescriptions were actually decreasing statistically significantly over that time period, which kind of raises an interesting question, which is, within the subgroup, are we able to fine-tune this population and better understand who we should be using this really expensive drug in? And perhaps not saying that this drug doesn't work because the clinical trials prove that, but actually pinpointing, using real-world evidence, who will get the most bang for our buck in. And I think this was a really interesting opportunity to use a variety of different data, conduct the study once a drug was released into the real world, and try to, inform some of those policy decisions in looking at who we should be paying this for, and tightening up the criteria based on what current medications that they're actually on. So those were a quick overview of a lot of different examples that we did, going over those 3 different areas. But I want to wind down a little bit, thinking about what it means to do this kind of work, working with policymakers. ODPRN, there's sort of a hierarchical understanding of what's actually happening there. And I think there's a massive disconnect sometimes between researchers and the policymakers. And they break down into certain areas that we understand here. And it begins with the end goal. Researchers, we can openly admit, we're obsessed with publications and promotions, and that's sort of what drives us, and often what we use as our commodity. Policymakers, in my experience, have found that the number one goal is the policy decision. They're really concentrated on what's coming up, and it's a very practical goal. But they also want to avoid the media, and they want to maintain the public image. So looking at things that are, strong evidence and being able to back up any of their decisions is important and crucial to them. There are research questions for researchers. We like to define it to the subpopulation. We would like to look at the utilization in Ontario between 2012 and 2015 in this group and looking at that. The policymakers might say, I see that tobramycin use is going up, and that's all you're going to get. And so being able to kind of find that halfway ground where you create a logical and straightforward question, but at the same time understanding that they might be facing larger, broader issues. One of the major issues and why real-world evidence is a really great opportunity is time limits. Researchers often take months to years to complete a study, while policymakers often want it last Friday. And so this becomes important in being able to be able to access data, have studies that are ready to go. And so being able to access data that's already established and from the real world, like the data available in Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, has made it a really great opportunity to be able to do research in a timely manner using high-quality data. Researchers are obsessed with a level of precision, and they want to be as precise as possible, while policymakers are okay with ballparks as long as they understand that. But they're also looking for metrics of value of the reporting that are easy to understand. And it's interesting, sometimes the paper looking at the inhaled tobramycin use resonates more than the Xolair study, which used more and much more complex methods. And so it's that utilization that becomes really important, and being able to communicate it in a way that's understandable. So some take-home messages after covering a lot of different evidence is that I do think that real-world studies can have an impact on shaping policy and reimbursement decisions. We've seen them countless times, and all the examples we gave were directly inputted and informed policy decisions in Ontario, and we have a lot of different examples that have shown that. It's important to work with the end users to develop actionable questions. I think that's the difference of why real-world evidence is really starting to take off, is that working with the people who need it and the policymakers and stakeholders are better understanding how important real-world evidence is, versus maybe about 10, 15 years ago, a lot of the observational work and the methodology work that was being done was a little bit siloed. But I think we gain a lot from working directly with policymakers to better understand what their needs actually are. Linked administrative claims data can be a very powerful tool in informing policy in a timely manner. And I think that this answers their questions. When they need something in a week or 2 weeks, we can say that yes, we can, because we know that data is available. We've conducted similar studies, versus saying, yeah, I'll get back to you in a year. By the time you return back with that study, it's not important anymore, or they've moved on to the next issue. I do want to highlight one thing that sort of is exciting about administrative claims data is work using pragmatic RCTs and linking that to it. So being able to do RCTs at a more efficient cost, but looking at those opportunities. For example, we're working on a project right now looking at academic detailing in long-term care homes. And we were able to go and link that to administrative claims data and look at the prescription values and then see how those patients did without having to go and collect information on hundreds of thousands of patients. Lastly, linking of data will make it more powerful. The data, on a daily basis, we're getting emails about how it's getting better and better. And so the data is getting better, which will allow more opportunities to ask better questions. Linking into registries, especially for rare drugs and rare diseases, will become a better opportunity to track these patients and do better research for populations that we were excluding from all our studies to begin with. And lastly, and I highlighted this in the very beginning, I think there's lots of work to be done in incorporating real-world evidence at market entry. We've had a few examples where we've done work on budget impact analyses, we've inputted into models at the very beginning, but it would be really great that the real-world evidence is actually part of the story, part of the submissions, and part of the plan as a drug enters the market. Currently, the only place that this is always in is understanding safety. I think it'd be very important that real-world evidence is part of understanding effectiveness, which is part of every reimbursement deal that goes forward. Now, again, I understand that sometimes the devil's in the details, but I think we'll leave it to a lot smarter people and policymakers to figure that out. But I do believe that the evidence, the methodologies, and the data is here today for us to be able to do these kinds of things. All right, thank you very much. And I'll take some of your questions. And if I don't get to any of the questions, you can email me or bother me on Twitter.
That was a great talk. I think we were all, you had us all enthralled. We were all really so we have some time for questions. Those of you online, you can send your questions into events@cadth.ca. But why don't we start within the room and see if we have any questions, Dr. Mina? Who's going to be the first victim? Okay. Michelle, go ahead.
So, so you've been doing that with ODPRN for a little while, I guess. So,
yeah.
So, I'm receptive with our policymakers, I guess, in terms of if you're, let's say you do real world effectiveness or safety, and somehow that would, the signal of the results would be not aligned with the current policy.
Yeah.
And then you need to, so a safety issue or one of the drugs within the drug class, perhaps, you know, you might have chosen the one, like one drug within a class, and then you realize that you actually might actually found the 3 drugs in the class. How would they, how receptive are they to entertain a change in policy?
So if I can boil down your question, you're asking what happens if the news, like I presented things that supported the policy. What if I showed a bad news or something? Yeah, if it conflicts with it. I think one thing is that the benefit of being an independent academic is that, you know, we can kind of report that. But on the other hand, realistically, I think working with policymakers means that it's a relationship. I think if the data shows something and there's a truth there, to be frank, I would be very certain of my work, and I would go back and probably conduct a million sensitivity analysis to make sure I quite understand the story. But if I trust the rigor of my work, then you have to present it to them. The next question becomes dissemination of that information. I think as an academic, we hold ourselves to the promise that we will, you know, publish all the information that we have. But at the same time, we're not going to catch the, you know, our colleagues as policymakers off guard, and we're going to share that information. So internally at ODPRN, every study that we conduct, we often will, if it's publishable, some studies are just not that interesting to anybody in the journals, but what we'll do is we'll write an internal report that goes to the OPDP, but then we will also publish a peer-reviewed paper. Now you can imagine, for a paper to go through peer review, it could take months to a year or longer, but they've already been sitting on that information for a while, and so we give them the head start, and then we also give them a heads up once it's published. We communicate with them about that information and what our messaging is. But to boil that down, I think it's our job doing this work that if there is a signal that's harming patients, that we have to sound that alarm. And I think that we hold that to a really high level, that's really important. And you can see that from a lot of the work we do in drug safety, where there are studies or drugs that are listed on the formulary that do have harms that were unknown until they hit the market, and then we had larger sample sizes. And, you know, personally, I do that kind of work all the time where we're looking at adverse events related to some of these medications. And if there is something there, then it's our job to kind of to educate prescribers.
In terms of process, then, would that information go to their local expert committee so that do they actually need a recommendation to act on this, or will they just use the evidence?
When it goes internally?
Yeah, for a change in policy, let's say.
I think we have certain colleagues that we interact with, and they know the work that we do, and we have a strong relationship. We talk to them on a regular basis. So they're sort of the counterpoint to us. What happens internally and what committees they send it to, that's sort of, you know, I think I'm guessing each province and each policymakers group has different sort of structures and ways that they do things, some probably being more nimble than others, and I don't want to kind of get into that, but internally they help us navigate it, and that's the point of developing that relationship. Often we'll ask them, okay, this may not be your work, maybe there's another group, like some of the opioids work, for example, sits outside of the drug program. And so they'll help us navigating who to send information to, and I think that's really important to being able to do that. And that comes with developing a relationship, not a hostile one, but knowing, hey, we found this finding we think is important for you, help us navigate to get this in the person who's, whose hands this is most needed in. Does that answer your question? Or?
The second question, Sarah?
So I was just curious, in your disclosure, you talked about receiving SPOR funding.
Yeah.
So I'm a patient engagement
Yeah,
officer at CADTH, so I was kind of curious how you work with patients, whether that's in, questions, priority setting, interpreting the data.
I'm so glad you asked that, because that was one area that I was putting together the slides, and I was like, I have not talked about patients. And really, that's our primary goal, is to not only impact positively their lives, but also to incorporate them to our research being SPOR funded. So we do that at ODPRN in two different ways. The first way, in a lot of the work we do, we actually have patient reps sitting on a lot of the studies. For example, the drug class reviews for every single one we drew from patients. We also conduct qualitative research because we feel like there's a lot of stories and contextualization that we're not getting from our data. So as much as I'm a data head and a junkie and I love my data, I understand its limitations. And I think there's a lot of things that we can't get at, and so we use those as well. One other thing that we've done, because we do policy work, is we actually have a wonderful citizens panel that we've been developing for multiple years now. And they're individuals who are, just like all of us, they're both citizens and patients. And they sit in their own, they have their own panel, and they're sort of self-governing, and they influence a lot of the work that we do, and they sit on our steering committee as well. And interestingly enough, we've incorporated them into every phase of our research in a lot of different ways, to the point where, and I'm going to show off here, that they've actually launched their own study project that we've worked with them on, and that's actually going to be coming out in September. I'm not going to say what it's about, so I don't want to steal their thunder, but it's really been a great cornerstone of a lot of the wonderful work we do at ODPRN, and engaging these patients and citizens has been essential to us. And so, importantly, for real-world evidence, often what we do, for me, when I launch studies, I sit down with the patient members of the team. I tell them what often the factors are. I ask them, which parts do you want to be involved in? Because I think a lot of people with patient-oriented research will say, you know what, let's just ask you to make sure my outcomes matter to you. But I want to know a lot more. I also want to know, when I develop my results, what do they think of them? I also want to know, when I'm disseminating my information and I send it to policymakers, which patient group should I send it to? What should I do with this information? So we actually ask them where they want to be involved, and they're often involved in a lot of those different phases. And so, it's been a really great, to be honest with you, it's a learning process for all of us, but I think we've been real leaders in being able to do that, and we're really proud of the work we do with patients. So thank you very much for asking that.
I actually have a question. As a fellow data head junkie, we've seen an improvement in the data available over the last 10 years. And we're looking at, and as you introduced, some opportunities for us to use this data to create policy change and great change. So currently, what do you feel are some of the current barriers that we have in the data sources available here to us in Canada?
Yeah, so one of the, I think right away, is linking across different provinces. So one thing I forgot, because I was so excited to talk to you guys, is the testosterone example. Way we were able to do that across provinces is by working with the amazing people at CADTH and the NPW team. They've been awesome to being able to do this. And I think an organization such as them gives us an opportunity to kind of be greater than borders. But I think for a lot of times when it comes to the linked administrative data and what's holding back a lot of people in doing this in a timely manner, like we're able to do in each singular province, is that you can't kind of run studies across different provinces. So if I could say that there's one major limitation, it's that for an organization such as CADTH, thinking about a national perspective, like it's easy for me to think about just Ontario, because we have a great institute and we could do that kind of work. And a lot of provinces have great institutes. It's the moment that you want to bring everybody together and do something nationally or replicate the same study. And a lot of groups are doing that, but they're finding that there's a lot of challenges to being able to do that, and the timelines are a little bit challenging to be able to meet. So, if someone tells you they want it by Friday, they're probably getting it Friday next year, right? So that becomes a little bit challenging to do versus like what we're used to being able to do in ISIS. I think the other thing is that the different sources of data coming in are starting to get a little bit more interesting, which means that there's going to be different learning that has to occur. So, for example, at ISIS, we've been able to recently, we got immigration data, and now they have lab data from OLIS. And so the data is getting richer, but that means that there has to be an investment in cleaning up that data, validating that data, and working with it. So it takes a place that has capacity to be able to do that, to invest in it. And it takes an investment into that kind of work to be able to do the wonderful work that we're doing.
Brian,
So many questions, so little time. So,
you have 2 minutes, Brian.
a little bit on the sources.
Yeah.
As a researcher, you just want enough data to be able to do the research that you're focused on. Did any of the case studies that you looked at involve data that was collected by the manufacturer?
No.
So as a researcher, what is your thoughts of using that data? And I'm asking that specifically because one of your last points talked about incorporating real-world evidence into market entry, and many of the regulators are looking at trying to use real-world evidence into that regulatory decision and in the post-market space. So just your thoughts as a researcher on
absolutely.
that data.
I think there's a great opportunity to work with registries, and I think that a lot of times that's sort of led by the manufacturers themselves, which they track some of the more rare medications that are used and biologics, and I think there's an opportunity for that. But I hesitate with the devil's being in the details, right? Again, I think it comes with this idea of independence and who's running the analysis and opportunities to do that kind of work. I think there's a huge potential to collaborate and be able to link some of those registries to other data sources that are already established. So I guess from a high level, I think it would be a great opportunity. My concerns, again, are being able to understand, like, you know, I think when it comes to these market entry reimbursement-based models, is understanding who's going to be actually doing the analysis, who's able to publish and freedom to publish as an academic. That would be my major concern, is having that ability to do that so that it's an unbiased and independent perspective. I think those are sort of the major issues that are holding back doing those kind of opportunities. I think on a data level, it's probably pretty simple to link a registry. I don't think that that's sort of holding anybody back. I think it's a lot more the issues with conflicts of interest and bias and figuring out a model that's fair to both sides and all stakeholders at the table.
Great.
You guys figure that out.
So I'm looking at time here. We'll probably end with this, and we have one last question, and it's coming from our online guest. So this comes from Kelly Gorman, who's with the Cancer Care Society. She said, great presentation. I misread, it's my fault, sorry. Just wondering, for the testosterone study, were you able to look at why it was being prescribed so much in Ontario, and were patients requesting it, or do you think it was doctors suggesting it?
So this is where the qualitative work comes in, and so we had the same question as well, like what was driving it, and a lot of our qualitative evidence suggested that a lot of the patients were requesting it. And so a lot of the times the patients were going in and asking for it because they'd heard from their colleagues. You know, one of the quotes I remember vividly is, you know, one of my friends said he used it and he's seen really great improvements, so I went and talked to my doctor about it and I got it too. And that was, you know, what we kept seeing. Do we have any quantitative measurements of that? No, and I think that that's one of the challenges in figuring that out. But again, that was sort of where that contextualization for qualitative evidence fits really nicely with all the other quantitative work that we were doing.
So with that, a huge thank you to Dr. Tadrous for a great presentation on real-world evidence, impact on policy, reimbursement. It was really great. We had a lot of people coming in. We had over 600 participants, which speaks volumes to you, with your star power, and also the content. So thank you. So for those of you who joined us today, thank you. And you can still email us our questions. We can forward them to Dr. Tadrous.
That'd be great.
And we look forward to you guys joining us for a future lecture series. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.